Thanks for joining us again. Another one of our Safer at Home series talks. I'm glad to have you with us tonight. Is it still snowing out by you? Because it's snowing here. This is as I told our guests tonight. Besides obviously COVID-19, this is why we're doing these virtual talks in the winter time. I don't want anybody driving in this stuff. So this is I'm being the good parent here. Just stay at home, stay safe. Before we get started tonight, a couple of things. As you know, our talk series is brought to you by First Citizens Federal Credit Union, Cape Cod 5, Martha's Vineyard Savings. All the books that are part of our series are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope you partake of their goods and purchase a book. If you've got a question, use the chat feature down below. Make sure you mute yourself. I had the distinct honor and pleasure of meeting our guest, Dr. Christopher Capozzola, when I was working in Marshfield, and he came out with a book called Uncle Sam Wants You, and was about World War I. And so I fully confess I was thrilled when he came out with a second book, and exceptionally thrilled when he said he would join us for one of our talks. Dr. Capozzola is a professor of history at MIT. This is his second book, and as I mentioned to him before, if you happen to be up at 5 in the morning on January 7th, you saw him on NBC 10 Boston talking about the events on the Capitol. So without further ado, would you welcome our guest tonight, Dr. Christopher Capozzola?
All right. Thank you, Mark. And thanks everybody for turning out tonight. Like Mark said, if we were doing this on a regular January night, all of you would be, sort of looking with one eye on the window in the parking lot to see how fast you could get home before the snow. So it is good that we can join virtually and safely. Thanks for Mark, to the Museums on the Green, to Eight Cousins Books, and really to everybody for turning out. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes or so about this new book that I've published, Bound by War: How the United States and the Philippines Built America's First Pacific Century. And I'm going to show a bunch of images, both for people who are familiar with this history and also for people who may not know this corner of the world or this chapter of the history of America and the world. And so what I'm going to do is sort of dive right in and hope that the technology works out here. I'm going to share my screen. And there we go from the beginning. All right, so what I'm going to do is sort of take a look first at the book, and I'm going to begin right where the book does at this location here, the Manila American Cemetery. This is located on 152 acres, just a few miles outside of the Philippine capital. It memorializes over 36,000 soldiers and sailors who fought and died under the American flag during the Second World War in the Pacific. Now, to enter this cemetery, if you go there, is to leave the noise and pace of 21st century Manila, one of Asia's largest cities. And here, the spacious grounds, which you can see are maintained with great care, offer the city's freshest air and its greenest grass. From this hilltop, near the former site of the US Army's Fort McKinley, the cemetery and its central memorial command remarkable views of the skyscrapers and apartment buildings of a booming Asian metropolis. Rolling hills to the east, and hazy sunsets over Manila Bay that cast shadows over the white marble gravestones below. As a memorial to the sacrifices of the Second World War, the cemetery is, as Lincoln said at Gettysburg, altogether fitting and proper. It's also, on most days, remarkably empty. The first time I ever visited, I was one of the only Americans there. I looked at the guest book, and it listed Australians, Japanese, several local residents enjoying a breezy Sunday afternoon, and just one other American, a woman from Burbank, California, with a typical Filipino surname. Perhaps she was a returning migrant, home for a visit and there to pay respects. Now, even in Manila, it is easy to overlook this place. The neighboring Fort McKinley, built after 1898, is long gone, transferred in 1949 to the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and more recently replaced by an upscale shopping center known simply as the Fort. But in the quiet moments that you can find on that Manila hilltop, the names at the memorial of the Pacific War tell a shared history of two nations that were bound together by a century of war. As the memorial attests, the US military has been in the Philippines for a long time, beginning in 1898, when the United States conquered the Spanish colony of the Philippines and annexed it to the United States, and then in the years from 1898 to 1946, when the Philippines was a US colony, and then still in the decades since independence in 1946, when the Philippines has been an American ally in Asia. Now, for all that time, Filipinos have also been in the United States Armed Forces. Beginning in 1899 and continuing to this day, hundreds of thousands of Filipinos and Filipino Americans have served under the American flag. The first were the Philippine Scouts, who you see here, recruited into Uncle Sam's service by US Army officers who were eager to defeat the Filipino national struggle that they referred to as the Philippine Insurrection. The Philippine Scouts were formed in 1899, formalized as part of the US Army in 1901. Now, over time, the Philippine Scouts, which began as a temporary tool of counterinsurgency, quickly became America's permanent mode of colonial rule. And in fact, by the 1920s, Philippine Scouts outnumbered US soldiers in the territory. But this isn't just an Army story. In the 1920s and throughout the interwar period, thousands of Filipinos joined the US Navy, some enlisting in the Philippines, others in the United States, nearly all of them restricted to bottom rung positions as cooks and stewards, where sometimes they served next to African Americans in a segregated naval force, and sometimes, in fact, replaced African Americans during periods when enlistment for African Americans in the Navy was completely barred. The Second World War is a crucial turning point, both in this history and also in the book that I wrote. And it called up hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, both in the United States and in the colonial territory of the Philippines. About 7,000 Filipinos who were living in the continental US joined the US Army directly and served in what were called the 1st and 2nd Filipino regiments. That's about 7,000 soldiers. More than 120,000 in the Philippines joined the ranks of the doomed Philippine Commonwealth Army, the force that met the invading Japanese army in 1942. At least 70,000 men and women joined guerrilla movements in the Philippines during the war that battled occupation and assisted American liberation in 1944. And the walls and the stones at the Manila American Cemetery include some, if not all, of these names. The memorial, I think, actually does a better job of recording Filipinos' World War service than most of our history books do. Right? And if this is a story that you remember from about one chapter of your high school history textbook, you can be forgiven. But I'm here to remedy that misstep by our high school teachers and our textbooks. Because this is a big story. Some 67,000 of the 76,000 prisoners who marched on the Bataan Death March were Filipinos, a story that most Americans don't know. And they served together and marched together under the American flag. Yet most of those soldiers in the Philippine Commonwealth Army or who fought as guerrillas waited until 2009 to receive equitable veterans benefits and citizenship rights from the US government that they fought for. And this, for me, is the central question of the book, right? Not only what were these soldiers doing in the US Armed Forces in the first place, but why did they wait so long to be treated fairly? It begins with those questions, but answering them requires a history of the entire Pacific, of both nations, and of the century in the Pacific that Americans and Filipinos built together. The book, as I try to write it, has three main aims. First, it seeks to restore this history, to document that the United States maintained a colonial army for most of the 20th century, not so different from other major powers in the world. Second, it seeks to view American history from the Pacific, something that might not come naturally to us here in New England, but to remind us that we have always been a Pacific power, and also to think broadly about what that means, that the Pacific Century was not just a talking point in US foreign policy, but in fact a lived experience by hundreds of thousands, even millions of people whose lives, migrations, work, culture, and families were shaped by this history. And third, along the way, for historians, I'm also trying to encourage us to think in new ways about the US military in American history. And to understand modern America, you need to understand the US military, not only as a fighting force, but also as a force of generation, something that creates and transforms social relationships, immigration patterns, ideas about race and culture and political justice. Now, all of those big questions are there from the beginning in 1898, when the Philippine Scouts first were established, and remain remarkably unchanged over the course of the 20th century. Most history books are histories of change, and in many ways I describe this as one of continuity, right, of the persistence of this relationship. What began in 1898 as a Pacific moment continues for nearly a century. And in fact, 1946, the point at which the Philippines becomes an independent country, is in fact not a crucial turning point. It's just another chapter in the story, because America's Pacific ambitions didn't end then either. The Philippines shifted, of course, from colony to ally. Hold on one second. I hope you can hear me, but I'm not having a little trouble with the screen. Mark, can you interrupt and let me know?
Yeah, I can hear you, but we're still bound by war here.
Okay. Well, in that case, maybe we'll just look at this picture for a little while.
It's the beauty of technology.
Yes. So, all right. So we'll look at this picture, and I'll just tell you what's in the book. Like I said, the Philippine independence doesn't bring this story to an end because the Philippines becomes a crucial Cold War ally. That Filipinos fought as allies of the United States in Korea, as well as in Vietnam. And that even with independence, the two nations and their soldiers and sailors would continue to serve together. In 1947, a bilateral treaty guaranteed the United States access to 23 military bases in the new nation, and also provided for the continued enlistment of up to 2,000 Filipinos a year in the US Navy. So during Vietnam, for example, US Air Force planes took off and landed from Clark Air Base in South Vietnam. American sailors arrived at Subic Bay Naval Station for leave or for the repair of their ships. Nor does the story end when the Cold War does. A generation later, Operation Enduring Freedom, a war that we understand as the war in Afghanistan, but was in fact actually part of a global war on terror, including the southern Philippines, where nearly 7,000 American soldiers served. As the US began the war in Iraq in 2003, about 31,000 non-citizen soldiers deployed to the Middle East. in US uniforms, 20% of those immigrant soldiers were Filipinos. And through it all, Filipinos and Filipino Americans who never wore a uniform were affected by the service of those who did. People with civilian jobs, factory workers, spouses, and families, generations together, sort of confronting this history and telling this story. And I'm going to just keep going with the image because the computer is frozen. Now, this also becomes, as I tell it in the book, an immigration history story. For most of the 20th century, service in the US Armed Forces offered the clearest path to migration and to US citizenship for Filipinos who wanted it. And we can easily see this on the landscape as some of the communities in the United States with the greatest percentage of Filipino Americans also happen to be US Navy towns. Vallejo, California, near Mare Island, National City, near Naval Station San Diego, Norfolk and Virginia Beach in Hampton Roads. In 2019, the United States counts some 4 million Filipino Americans, one of the nation's fastest growing ethnic groups. Many trace their family histories to a father or an uncle in a US military uniform, and when they don't, someone else's father or uncle casts a shadow. Military service in US uniforms also provided Filipinos a language of patriotism and sacrifice, and therefore of equality. Immigrants and their children used those words not only to wage a decades-long struggle for equity for World War II veterans, but also to find a place for themselves in America, making their service part of America's military history, making their protests and lawsuits part of its civil rights legacy, handing down mindsets and memories of war and the military from one generation to the next. So what I want to do now is tell the story of the heart of the book. And I'm going to ask Mark if you can you take over the screen? And then maybe I'll be able to get back in.
All right, what do you want me to do?
So, just trying to see if there's any way to get this to work, because I think people will enjoy this talk a lot more if they can see the images. So be patient, audience members. There we go. All right, let me try this again.
If we were live, this would be the time I'd look at you and say, talk amongst yourselves.
Okay, I think we're stuck, and I'm just going to keep going. All right. So the story I want to tell at the heart of the book is a law called the 1946 Rescission Act, which is probably the most important, one of the most important laws that you've never heard of. It is a law that retroactively, after World War II, stripped some 200,000 Filipino soldiers of naturalization rights and veterans benefits. And this Rescission Act becomes the heart of Filipino Americans' wartime and post-war experiences. And what I want to do is give you a little history of the Rescission Act. This is one of the chapters right in the middle of the book. The promises that were made during World War II, how they were broken, and how in the 6 decades after World War II, they were repaired. Now, like I said at the beginning, Filipinos served under the American flag in several different forces, but regardless of how they served, they earned and in fact were promised citizenship rights and veterans benefits in both law and policy. In a famous line from General Douglas MacArthur, who said, "Equal pay for equal risk." He equalized the pay rates of Filipino and American soldiers. Now, during the war, this was not so much of an issue, but immediately after the war, soldiers began filing petitions for naturalization and claims on US citizenship under the amendments from 1942 to the Nationality Act of 1940, which throughout the world promised non-citizen soldiers serving in the US Armed Forces a rapid path to naturalization. And in fact, during World War II, about 140,000 immigrant soldiers served and gained citizenship. Some of them were Filipinos, in fact, actually, not in the Philippines, but elsewhere. Right? And part of the reason that very few Filipinos naturalized in the Philippines is a deliberate act by the US government. On August 1st, 1945, the US government authorized the vice consul in Manila to carry out the naturalizations, basically saying, all right, this citizenship should be granted. But that authority very quickly came under scrutiny. And the evidence is mentioned in many places, but it no longer exists in the archives. And historians and lawyers and others have looked for a generation for the smoking gun that would prove this, but it appears to have been destroyed soon after the war. But as far as we know, officials in both the US and the Philippine colonial government appear to have agreed that mass naturalization of Filipino soldiers would open the doors for large-scale emigration of Filipino veterans to the United States, which is a result that neither government relished. As the US Attorney General at the time, Tom Clark, said, quote, "It would be a political embarrassment and a drain of manpower to have a mass exodus of the young Filipino ex-fighting men and women going to the United States on the eve of independence." So soon there was a solution worthy of Catch-22, that famous World War II novel. On September 13th, 1945, right, notice that date, just days after Japanese officers surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, the US Commissioner of Immigration wrote to the Attorney General, Tom Clark, asking that the vice consul be removed and omitting to designate anyone else. So Clark approved this maneuver, and basically what that means is that although Filipino soldiers had a legal right to claim US citizenship, there was no one in the country to whom they could turn to carry out the procedure. Only in August 1946 did the INS return, and during a brief window between August and December 31st of that year, about 4,000 Filipinos acquired US citizenship out of some 200,000 who fought under the American flag during the war. Now, none of this troubled Arizona Senator Carl Hayden, who was a kind of central figure in the middle of this book. Hayden argued that Filipino soldiers fought, quote, because they desired freedom for their country and not with the idea of acquiring the right to go to another country. The US Justice Department's maneuvers foreclosed large-scale naturalizations, but it also denied basic rights to Filipino soldiers who had marched next to American soldiers and been captured with them at Bataan. This was not America's finest hour. Then came a second broken promise. Filipino soldiers were going to be expensive, with lifetime benefit costs of 190,000 veterans running possibly as high as $3.2 billion. So once again, Senator Carl Hayden, together with two others, drafted what would become known as the 1946 Rescission Act, a final version of which includes a provision inserted during an off-the-record debate that, quote, service in the organized military forces of the Philippines shall not be deemed military service for the purpose of any law conferring rights, privileges, or benefits. In plain English, what that means is that Filipino soldiers were not American soldiers, at least when it came time to pay benefits. The law thus blocked any individual claims by Filipino veterans to those benefits that GIs took for granted. No GI Bill, no college loan, no home mortgage, no medical care, no widow's stipend, not even a flag for a soldier's casket. This was not America's finest hour either. Now, when the bill arrived on the desk of President Harry Truman, he very much wanted to veto it, but he was mindful of the pressures of post-war politics. He knew the desperate plight of the Philippines. He was aware of the practical difficulties of making payments to veterans in another country. And so on February 18th, 1946, he signed the Rescission Act into law, nearly 75 years ago. He appended a signing statement saying that there existed, quote, a moral obligation of the United States to look after the welfare of Philippine Army veterans. Meanwhile, he assured, quote, our comrades in the Philippines that the issue is, quote, receiving attention and is being expedited as much as possible, making Harry Truman the first of literally a dozen presidents to promise action at some later date and fail to take it in his own presidency. For Filipino veterans, the Rescission Act is the most painful moment in their shared history, a broken promise that would remain unfinished business. Now, it would in fact take 63 years to undo the harm that the Rescission Act had caused. And in the second half of Bound by War, I tell that story alongside the military history of Filipinos in Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq. Because I think that that story of the veterans is a crucial chapter in America's civil rights heritage. Now, by the late 1980s, much had begun to change. You started to see an upsurge in organized political efforts, focused particularly on the US Congress, that sought to gain full equity for Filipino veterans. And I like to say that there are 5 reasons that explain what changed in the 1980s and 1990s to make it possible for the veterans to gain their benefits. First, in 1986, brought the end of the administration of Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos. With that disappeared the close ties that Marcos had formed with World War II veterans groups. And in fact, actually, in some ways, brought the issue out of political controversy that surrounded the Marcos regime. As the politics of martial law divided Filipino American communities, the one issue that they could all agree on was support for veterans' benefits. Second, the end of the Cold War in 1989 and the closure of US military bases in the Philippines after 1991 brought a drastic decrease in US foreign aid budget for the Philippines. Now, for decades, that tactic, foreign aid, had been the maneuver that Philippine politicians had pursued in the hopes of winning funds for the veterans. But now, politicians in Manila quickly realized that the Cold War language of foreign aid was going to yield very few results. Third, back in the United States, Filipino Americans began to organize in social movements, particularly after the 1960s. They're learning lessons from the civil rights movement. They're learning lessons from the kind of immigrant and ethnic revival of the 1970s. And you see this all across the country, but particularly in my research, I found it in California, in Los Angeles and San Francisco, where Filipino American students participated in student movements of the 1960s, where Filipino workers joined the long grape strikes of the United Farm Workers in the 1960s and 70s, and where ethnic, multinational, explicitly pan-ethnic Asian American movements created a new political agenda. Now, there's a key turning point here in 1988, when Japanese Americans who had experienced incarceration during the Second World War won a major victory in Congress with the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And this becomes a model for Filipino veterans and their advocates to rethink Congress, to really see a path to redemption in Congress for undoing the harm of the Rescission Act. Now, the fourth big transformation is the increase in Asian American political power. Following the Immigration Act of 1965, which ends national quotas, significantly increases immigration rates to the United States, Filipino populations continued to increase. reaching almost 2 million by the late 1980s, almost 3 million by the late 1990s, and like I said, almost 4 million by 2020. Asian Americans, not only Filipinos, found increasing representative voice in Congress. Long-serving senators, such as Hawaii's Daniel Inouye and Daniel Akaka, gained seniority. Representative Norman Mineta of California formed the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus in 1994. And representatives with large Asian American constituencies, such as Representative Bob Filner of San Diego, began paying increasing attention to their concerns, particularly as more immigrants naturalized and registered to vote as US citizens. Their voice was beginning to be heard. And finally, another key turning point is a little hard to pin down a date to, but over the course of the 1980s and 1990s, American political culture embraced the Greatest Generation as a metaphor for heroic American citizenship, paying close attention to all World War II veterans, including veterans of color. Hollywood movies certainly captured the headlines, but legislation poured out of congressional veteran subcommittees recognizing the Second World War, a move that was all the more urgent as the aging and shrinking population of veterans declined by the mid to late 1990s. So by this point, the ongoing dismissal of the claims of Filipino veterans, the appeal to the Rescission Act as sort of a fast law on the books that could not be changed, no longer aligned with what Americans believed about their country. And so we see a key turning point in 1990, November 1990, with the passage of the Immigration and Naturalization Act, which granted to most Filipino veterans a 2-year window of opportunity to naturalize. Now, supporters of that bill sort of repeated General Douglas MacArthur's wartime insistence on equal pay for equal risk. But this was just a citizenship bill, right? Not a veterans benefits bill. But it had a big impact of about 70,000 surviving eligible veterans in 1990, some 28,000 naturalized by 1998, and of those, about 17,000 migrated to the United States, where many were able in turn to invoke family reunification laws to sponsor the migration of their families and their relatives from the Philippines to the US. But like I said, the question of benefits remained. Throughout the 2000s, Filipino World War II veterans continued on Capitol Hill, where advocates repeatedly introduced legislation. And in fact, the VA by the 2000s actively endorsed it as a necessary reform. But time and again, it stalled in committee or on the floor of the House or Senate. Long-standing assumptions about the foreignness of Filipino soldiers and about the costs of granting full equity persisted. In late 2008, North Carolina Senator Richard Burr objected to, quote, aid for foreigners, and warned that equity legislation would, quote, take money away from our veterans in this country, despite the fact that these were our veterans and they meant most of them lived in this country. January 2009, however, brought a new constellation of forces. Among other things, it was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, but it also brought the 111th Congress, which placed Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii in the chair's seat in the Senate Committee on Appropriations, Senator Daniel Akaka of Hawaii in charge of the Senate's Committee on Veterans Affairs, and across the Capitol, their colleague Bob Filner at the head of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs. Together, these three, along with many others, succeeded in folding the long-standing proposed legislation for Filipino veterans' equity into the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the Recovery Act era, which was signed in February of 2009. Now, one of those many provisions of that law, which I'm sure all of you have read cover to cover, but buried deep within it, is a brief passage that authorized up to $198 million to pay lump sums of $15,000 to eligible veterans of World War II from the Philippines. Now, it also sort of undid this the insult of the Rescission Act by designating that wartime service in the Philippines was, in fact, active service in the US Armed Forces for the purpose of administering VA benefits. But as you can imagine, for a law that was passed in 2009, this was for many too little, too late. There were perhaps between 15,000 and 18,000 surviving World War II veterans at that time. And the passage of time and the challenge of documenting guerrilla service 7 decades after the fact meant that the VA recognized only some 12,400 applicants, about half of them in the United States and half of them in the Philippines. Now, the achievement of these lump sum payments in the Recovery Act of 2009 came with flourishes of sort of national patriotism and sort of nostalgia for the greatest generation. Representative Michael Honda, the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, boasted that, quote, after a decades-long struggle, Filipino World War II veterans have finally received the recognition and compensation they deserve for their brave service to the US during World War II. This had all the markings of a happy ending, and I was tempted many times to end my book there, because in fact, in many ways it is. But what I decided to do is give the final word to one of the advocates for the veterans, Lillian Galedo, co-chair of the National Alliance for Filipino Veterans Equity, who was, I think, more right than she realized when she described this as, quote, yet another beginning. Because the Filipino World War II veterans will soon fade into history, but the political struggles and the military struggles that they embodied and that they endured, and the bonds that they created between the United States and the Philippines are sure to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Capozzola. I asked you a question that I told you I was going to repeat to you before everybody came on. And I said, going through this book, I can't believe it was fun for you to write. It was a comfortable subject. This is not a happy topic. Is that fair for you to say that this wasn't you didn't get that warm fuzzy feeling when you were writing this, did you? I mean,
no. I mean, this is a difficult history, and I think I had known, some of the outlines of this, but I think I had not known until I really started listening, for example, to the veterans, right? Had not known kind of what a painful experience it was for them to hear it. And so, no, it was not, it wasn't necessarily fun to research, but I also found it really inspiring to hear the stories of people who really continued to kind of fight to make America sort of, fulfill its promises, to be the better part of the country that we can be to those who serve in our armed forces.
I remember when I was in high school, I read about Rudyard Kipling, and it got me interested in how England and India were involved as part of their empire. And as I'm going through your book, I couldn't, the parallels to me were striking. That this was the kind of this, in a way, it was a kind of our crown jewel of our empire, if you will, and yet they were clearly third-class citizens in the eyes of the military, the government, et cetera. Is that a fair parallel?
Well, yes and no. That certainly the United States, and one of the things that I try to show in this book is that the United States is an empire and sort of maintained a colonial army. Right? The Philippines was a colonial force, much like Britain had, or France, or the Netherlands, or even Japan, maintained forces like this in the 20th century. It was not as central to the American economy, to the American sort of, in fact, as India was to Britain. But nevertheless, there were sort of, systems of exclusion that kept Filipinos from becoming fully part of the United States, both during the colonial period and after independence in 1946.
Can you give that statistic again that you gave before about the Bataan Death March? How many Filipinos? I mean, that was mind-boggling to me.
Yes. If I had, sort of a one-line sort of reason for why people should read this book, it's that statistic, right? That as far as we know, about 76,000 men were captured at Bataan in 1942 and participated in the Bataan Death March, a multi-day sort of harrowing experience where they were marched from the Bataan Peninsula in northwestern Philippines to prison camps in the central Philippines by the Imperial Japanese Army. About 76,000 prisoners participated in that. And I think, if I have it by heart, 67,000 of the men on that march were Filipinos who served in this force, the Philippine Commonwealth Army, that was deemed later in 1946 to be not part of the US Armed Forces, even though Douglas MacArthur commanded it, even though they marched with American flags, flying above them and American flags on their uniforms. This was the Rescission Act sort of took away that service and disrespected the sacrifices they made at Bataan and after.
If you have any questions, make sure you use the chat feature. You start your book, literally the involvement of the U.S. in the Philippines starts with war. As you mentioned, that we all go back to our junior high school days, and we get a little paragraph in our textbooks about the Spanish-American War, and most of it, what's remembered is Teddy Roosevelt and San Juan Hill. But the Philippines, as a direct result of that, and there's a revolution going on that the United States essentially inherits, and takes over. So for those that don't recall that, could you just kind of fill in how this whole thing starts?
Yeah. So in the book, I start with this first encounter between Americans and Filipinos, and tonight I talked mostly about, in some ways, the middle of the book, World War II. But the United States begins a war with Spain in 1898, and this leads to a conflict over Spain's colonies, which include not only Cuba, where most of the war with Spain is fought, but also the Philippines, where with the Navy under Commodore Dewey, George Dewey, the US Navy invades and occupies and then soon annexes under the Treaty of Paris and the Philippines as a US colony. But Mark, like you said, the United States is moving like right into the middle of a national revolution that is already underway, at least since 1892. Filipinos have been fighting for their national independence from Spain. And so the United States is sort of intervening in that and very quickly finds itself carrying on a war, not against Spain, but in fact, actually against the Philippines. In a war that lasts much longer and includes far more soldiers, right? The number of US soldiers in country in the Philippines peaks at about 76,000 in 1900. US forces in Iraq peaked at about 180,000 for a much larger country a century later. And so I think it gives you a sense of just how central the Philippine-American War was to Americans at the time, but how little it has been remembered and in the generations since.
Got a couple questions coming in here. How would you compare our treatment of Filipino veterans to that of our Vietnamese and Hmong allies post-Vietnam era?
That's a great question. And in fact, during the Vietnam War, not only did Filipino soldiers sort of fight as allies of the United States, but the United States continued its policy of finding sort of local soldiers and recruiting them and having them fight with or for the United States, including sort of Hmong populations in Southeast Asia, whose service was during the war itself not officially recognized. And so it took, again, a sort of generation of struggle by Hmong veterans to sort of gain recognition for their service and again, rights to migrate and to naturalize. And in many ways, the story is quite similar. It is a story of Southeast Asian immigrants forming alliances with other ethnic groups, finding powerful voices in in Congress, in this case from places like Minnesota and Wisconsin, where Hmong settlements are biggest, and really sort of tapping into America's sense of obligation to veterans that in the 90s, 2000s, and today has kind of made those voices more audible than they would have been even in the 1970s while that service was taking place.
What were the deciding factors leading to Filipino independence?
Well, a whole bunch of reasons that it was discussed almost as soon as the Philippines became a colony. Making it independent was also discussed, and this became wrapped up in partisan politics at the time. Republicans were very much in favor of maintaining the colony, Democrats largely in favor of independence. For some, this was a question about immigration, and the thinking was that only by formally making the country formally independent could the United States formally exclude Filipinos and reduce immigration numbers from the 20s and 30s. It also became a question of trade. There were concerns that Philippine agricultural products were harming the United States during the Depression. And there were also diplomatic concerns. As war clouds gathered in Asia, there was concern that having a US colony in the Philippines might invite war with Japan. And so in 1934, the US Congress voted to promise independence to the Philippines 10 years later, right? Supposedly in 1944, of course, because of the war, that's postponed until 1946. And so right after the US invades, there's a brief thought about whether to postpone independence, but Roosevelt, Truman, MacArthur, and Filipino leaders are really sort of keen from the beginning to say, no, we're going to stick with July 4th, 1946, Independence Day.
Question here is, I am Filipino. How did you get interested in this topic?
I sort of backed into this topic with an interest in the US military, and interest in citizenship and immigration, and really kind of wanting to kind of bring those big themes together. But the specific form of it, I think, was informed in the late 2000s when I was watching kind of Filipino veterans on Capitol Hill. And it was a story that I didn't know anything about. I didn't understand it. I had never been taught it. And knowing what most of us know about veterans and how they're, the kind of respect and honor that America treats them with, the idea that, that these people would be denied seemed so puzzling to me. And I said, well, there's got to be a history here. And then I kind of backed into the story of the Philippine Scouts, who, despite being well known for their contributions to the Second World War, have never been the subject of a single standalone book before, and realized that this was a history that just needed to be told. And I've done this, and this is where I think it's really important. I've done this in collaboration, not just with military historians, but with immigration and ethnic historians, and Filipino Americans who kind of recorded their own community histories and oral histories. And I think that's a really important kind of part of that project is not just to tell this history to Filipinos, but with them, right? That part of what Americans need to do is sort of build those kinds of sort of respectful, equitable alliances, not only in our politics, but also in how we tell our history.
Can you discuss the ethnic and religious differences within the Philippines? How did this impact service? How does this impact service in the U.S. Armed Services?
Well, it's that of course, the Philippines is ethnically and particularly linguistically diverse country, and that sort of was very apparent to the United States military as they arrived in 1898. And they began at the first point in sort of thinking that there would be a kind of an ethnic divide and rule approach, much like what they had used to conquer Native American nations in the US West. sort of in some ways kind of playing off divisions within the Philippines. What they didn't count on was, in fact, actually that Filipinos were pretty united in wanting their national independence and also wanting the Americans to leave. And so their effort at dividing and conquering proved, they weren't successful at dividing, although they were ultimately successful at conquering. But as they recruited Filipinos into this force, the Filipino Scouts, they did sort of try to manage language, manage religion, and in the image that you looked at for most of the talk when the PowerPoint was stuck, if you notice on the right that some of those soldiers are Filipino Scouts, and they're wearing hats that have no brims, in part because they're Muslim, right? And their religious practice requires them to be able to touch their head to the ground when they pray. Some of the first kind of religious accommodations for Muslim soldiers that the U.S. Army ever had, almost as decades before anything in the 21st century.
How do you see the future of the Philippine Armed Forces in terms of their relationship with the United States going forward?
Well, that's a question where historians always say we don't, we focus, our expertise is the past and not the future. But I'll take a chance on this, which is in the last, say, 10 years or so, there have been moments of conflict and tension, and that have kind of captured the headlines, particularly because the rhetoric of politics in both the United States and the Philippines has become more heated and more partisan in the last 10 or 20 years. And of course, the question is the US-Philippine alliance and its relationship to China, which of course is growing in military power and economic power. And obviously, Filipinos need to confront their relationship with China, and that's their national destiny to work out. I always say that, borrowing from kind of Philippine thinkers, that the central question in Philippine foreign policy is, are we better off with the Americans or without them? That was a Cold War question for thinking about the Soviet Union. That's still the same question today. Right? And Filipinos are not of one mind about that. There are some who say that the only way to balance China's strength is to remain an ally of the United States. There are others who say the only way to prevent becoming kind of roadkill in a conflict between the United States and China is to separate ourselves from the United States. That's a question that remains to be answered. But the fact of the matter is, connections between Filipinos and Americans, right? If you move away from governments to people, those connections are still enormously strong, right? That a popular poll, some 80% of Filipinos think highly of the United States when asked in kind of an international survey. That number is higher than the percentage of Americans who think highly of the United States. Right. So in fact, the ties between these two countries, cultural, economic, familial, those are very strong, and I think are not going anywhere.
You're a man after my own heart. That's is a true history major. We look at it after it's happened, then we analyze. How long did it take you to research this?
I would say I worked on this book for about 10 years, and I would have worked on it for 110 years if I could. That the collections and archives for this are scattered throughout the United States and across the Pacific. And one of the biggest tasks that I undertook was really kind of assembling this and trying to redress the fact that in any archive you walk into, most of it was preserved by the Americans, and it tells their history. And that the Filipino side of the story has been harder to recover. A lot of that is the product of the Second World War. Archives that were destroyed, that were burned, paper that became so scarce that it was sort of, that the archives were plundered and reused, the paper reused for other purposes. And some of that is about economic disparities. More was preserved more carefully in the United States. But like I said before, there are community historians who've recorded the history of Filipino Americans in the United States. There are sort of oral historians who recorded the stories of World War II veterans. I did some interviews with World War II veterans, but as you can imagine, many of them have passed from the scene, or their best stories were recorded 30 or 40 years ago, and I'm very thankful for that. But I also dug into diplomatic archives, sort of the government records, newspaper archives, and increasingly, by the time to tell the story of the 1980s and 1990s, you have to watch a lot of old TV, which much of it, thankfully, has been saved and recorded for scholars.
Was the state and State Department, Defense Departments cooperative with this, or did you have to do an end run on them? Or
I would say that for the most part, they have been. There are, of course, there are matters related to intelligence and national security that are not going to be declassified anytime too soon. But there's a, kind of the standing processes of declassification, in part supported by a project called the Cold War International History Project, which also runs something called the Digital National Security Archive. Was really useful here. This is an organization that systematically requests declassified documents, for example, related to the end of the Marcos government in 1986. And those are sort of systematically requested by volunteer organizations, recorded and preserved for scholars down the road.
And before I let you go, how is teaching holding up at MIT throughout all of COVID?
Well, we are enduring, and our students are, about a quarter of them were on campus this fall, and about 2/3 will be joining us in the spring. History classes are entirely remote. Basically, our in-person classes are restricted to things like robots and radioactive material, neither of which I teach with. So we remain remote, and in some ways it's forced us to really get more creative about what's out there in the digital world, sort of with images, with films, with websites, and so forth. If any of you on the call are teachers or teaching, or if you're homeschooling, your Corona Homeschool Academy, that kind of scramble that we're all doing right now. So I'm happy to share with Mark the PowerPoint that I prepared, and if any of you want to request it through him or directly to me, I'll make sure that you get it if you're interested in those images.
All right. Well, thank you very much for doing this. I greatly appreciate it. As you know, I'm a huge fan of yours. So thank you very much for doing this. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Hopefully, there's not going to be much shoveling, although it hasn't been that white of a winter. So maybe it's nice to see a little white. But Chris, thank you so very much for doing this. Good luck with this book. I appreciate you doing this. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Stay safe, everyone.
All right. Thank you.